إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى أهله ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم، ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد، فإن خير الحديث كتاب الله، وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها، وكل محدثة بدعة، وكل بدعة ضلالة، وكل ضلالة في النار. We give praise and thanks to Almighty Allah. We ask Him to shower His blessings upon the noblest of mankind, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Alhamdulillah. Last week we took a hadith with regards to Salat al-Jumu'ah. We're still in Bab of Bab al-Salah, Kitab al-Salah, and Bab of al-Jumu'ah. So we'll be continuing today. But before then, there is a correction I'd like to make about a hadith that I mentioned last week when a question was posed with respect to the evidences for parents getting rewarded for what their children did, or the evidence for someone getting rewarded if he did something without knowing, what the reward was at the time that he did it. So we explained to us that knowledge of the specific reward does not, is not required for one to be rewarded for an act of ibadah that one does. What is required is that the person knows that he's worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by this deed, and that generally when you do acts of ibadah, you get rewarded. That suffices for one to be rewarded. So I brought a hadith as evidence. Sorry, there's some. Let me try and silence this interruption. Okay, now, so I brought a hadith about parents being rewarded for the Quran that their children had memorized. In this hadith, I mentioned that they will be given clothes of gold. But what the hadith actually says is reported. Now it says that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever reads the Quran, learns it, and acts in accordance with it on the day of resurrection, his parents will be given a crown to wear, whose light will be like the light of the sun, and his parents will be given garments which far surpass everything that is found in this world. They will say, why have we been given this to wear? It will be said, because your child learned the Quran. So this hadith is narrated by Al-Hakim, and Sheikh Al-Albani authenticated it in his book Sahih Targhib. One of the things we learn from here is that or rather, let's put it this way. Perhaps a question the underlying question behind the question that was posed last week was, is it possible to get rewarded for something one has not done? Especially when Allah says, وَلَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. There's nothing for man except for what he strives for. Isn't it then contradictory that one will get something that he has, in quotes, not worked for? There's no contradiction on the matter. Human beings will not get except what they work for, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. However, in addition to what they worked for, Allah will give them things. Or answering it another way, Allah will give them in excess of what they worked for. So remember the hadith of someone who intends a good deed and gets it done. You will get a minimum of 10 rewards to 700 to more. Allah increases for whomsoever He wills. And if somebody intends a good deed but is unable to do it, or is unable to do it, Allah will give him a full good deed. If he intends evil and he turns away from doing it, he will get a reward. If he intends evil and he goes ahead to do it, he will get one sin written to his record. Now, when it comes to sins, Allah gives you exactly what you have done. But when it comes to reward, Allah is Al-Wadud, is Al-Kareem, He is generous. He gives you what you have worked for, but multiplies it. He's not one who will give you one for one when it comes to good deeds. He's generous. Is the treasures of the heavens and the earth belong to Him. So He's not one that will give you one for one in that instance. Giving you one for one in the case of sins is due to His mercy. Giving you more than one for good that you did is due to His bounty and His mercy also. So the slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, once he does something which acquires Iman, once he acquires Iman, then he opens himself up to the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once he just has Iman, then he opens himself up to receive things, quantities that he has not worked for. So if he does a good deed, instead of getting one, he'll get 10. Out of that 10, he worked for only one. The remaining 9 is a bonus from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He would not have gotten it if he didn't work for Iman. So in that sense, وَلَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. He got that bonus of 9 because he worked for Iman. Nobody who didn't work for Iman will get that 9. Nobody who didn't work for Iman will get even 1 of good deed. But if you work for Iman, you will get what you worked for. You will also get bonuses. You will also get what you didn't work for. Once you work for Iman, you will get what you worked for. You will get bonuses, minimum of 9 times what you did. Then you will get, in addition, what you didn't even work for, like in the case of these parents. This hadith covers parents who sent their kids to learn the Quran, and it also covers parents who didn't. Their kids just went to learn the Quran on his own. The hadith says, whoever reads the Quran, learns it, and acts in accordance with it on the day of resurrection. So it's not only learning, but acting in accordance with it also. On the day of resurrection, his parents will be given a crown to wear, whose light will be like the light of the sun, and his parents will be given garments which far surpass everything that is found in this world. They will say, why have we been given this to wear? It will be said, because your child learned the Quran. So here it is a child. They didn't say that the Prophet ﷺ didn't say that the parents taught that child. He just said anybody who learns and practices the Quran, his parents will receive this. His parents will receive this. Of course, that is conditioned on them having worked for Iman. If they were kuffar, they will not get anything. They will not get anything. But if they had worked for Iman, in addition to what the things that they did themselves, Allah will give them bonuses related to that. Then things that they didn't work for, like the action of this child, if they didn't send the child to learn the Quran, they will also receive rewards for that. So this is part of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, when the people of Al-Jannah have entered Al-Jannah, there will still be space and Allah will create new people and put them there. They didn't come to the world to face any test. They didn't come to the world to face any test. So with all this, we see that وَلَيْسَ الْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. Yes, it's valid. There's nothing for man except what he strives for. The minimum that is required of him is Iman. Once he has it, he is sure that he will not, even if he enters Jahannam, he will not perish there. He will come out one day. Then two is that he will be entitled not only to the things that he has worked for, but he will be entitled to bonuses because of the things he has worked for. And thirdly, he'll be Allah will give him things. He will stand, liable to receiving, things that he hasn't even worked for. So this is just the addition I'd like to make with respect to the last one. The question is, how does the current interpretation explain the saying that non-Muslims are also rewarded for good deeds, but only in this world and in the hereafter? Now, not in the hereafter. Now, the explanation, which non-Muslims, once one is not a Muslim, you don't owe Allah anything, subhanahu wa ta'ala. If he wills, he will reward you, not reward, he will give you what he wills in this world. He says, Man kana yuridul hayat al-dunya, Man kana yuridul hayat al-dunya nuwaffihi fiha man, the verse skips me a little, but it's whoever wants this world will give out of it to whom we want. We'll give what of it to whom we want. So a kafir is not guaranteed of getting anything for any good deed that he does in this world because he doesn't have the Iman. Some of them, Allah will give them. And you see them, they will have things of this world. But you also see, and we witness that based on this verse of the Quran, that you will see kuffar, Allah will not give them anything of this world. Look at some of these Hindus and co. When you watch them on this, they are terribly poor, they are of low castes, and they serve the castes that are kuffar above them. They are so, impoverished, they get nothing of this world and they die upon that. They were kuffar, they got nothing of the world. And Yawm al-Qiyamah, of course, the hell will be their abode. So for anyone who, in fact, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, this world, Allah gives it to whomsoever he wills. Whether Muslim or kafir, this world, he gives it to whomsoever he wills. Nobody is guaranteed anything. However, what you are guaranteed is the hereafter. So if you're kafir, Allah gives some kafir. If you're Muslim, Allah gives some Muslim this world. If you're a kafir, Allah withholds from kafir. If you're Muslim, Allah withholds from Muslims. as he wills, when he wills, how he wills, what quantity he wills. But in the hereafter, the kuffar will not have anything. The Muslims will have whatever their heart desires in the hereafter. So bringing all those evidences together, the ones that say that وَلَيْسَ الْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, once you do sa'yu, effort to get iman, then you get those three things we talked about. What you work for, things linked to what you work for, and things that you didn't work for, that are bonuses from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. The hadith talked about giving them a crown and garments in the hereafter. If Allah now wills, part of the ziyada that he will give you will also happen in this world. If he wills, part as a Muslim, part of the ziyada will happen in this world. Now as a kafir, he didn't work for iman. So there's nothing for him in the hereafter, case closed. He will not get anything for the good he did. قُلْ أَلْ نُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِالْأَخْسَرِينَ أَعْمَالًا. Shall I not inform you of the worst of losers with respect to deeds that he did? الَّذِينَ ضَلَّ سَعْيُهُمْ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. Their deeds were lost. Allah didn't use rewarded, even though sometimes he just rewards them. I mean, he just gives them something, not reward them. ضَلَّ سَعْيُهُمْ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَهُمْ يَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّهُمْ يُحْسِنُونَ صُنْعًا. Their deeds were lost in this world, and they still thought, or whilst they were thinking, that they had put something forth for the hereafter. Kufar now. Allah explaining that, he said, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِآيَاتِ رَبِّهِمْ وَلِقَائِهِ فَحَبِطَتْ أَعْمَالُهُمْ فَلَا نُقِيمُ لَهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَزْنًا. These are the people who disbelieved in Allah and the meeting with him. Therefore, their deeds became null and void in this world. Because it became null and void, there was nothing to reward. And because there's nothing to reward, فَلَا نُقِيمُ لَهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَزْنًا. There is nothing, the scale will not be appointed for them Yawm al-Qiyamah, because there's nothing to weigh of good deeds. However, will they get anything of this world? Yes, they will get. Who Allah wills will get. Whoever Allah will, their case will not be different from the Muslim in terms of getting things. Their case, and we see it, is real life, not only limited to the text. You see it. They will have power, Muslims will have power. They will have wealth, Muslims will have wealth. They will experience poverty, Muslims will experience poverty. So now, I hope that clarifies it. Does it?
Naam, jazakumullah khair.
Wa alaikum, barakallahu fikum. So let us go to today's hadith, inshallah. Is the hadith of Salama ibn al-Aqwa. وكان من one second. وكان من أصحاب الشجرة. Let me expand it so we're able to. Okay. وكان من أصحاب الشجرة. He was one of the companions of the tree. What does that mean? Can anybody tell us what that means? Say somebody was Ashabu Shajara. I mean Ashabi Shajara. Shajara is a tree. Okay,
So I think the people that did Bay'ah with Rasul are referred to in Surah 49.
Barakallah fiqh. Barakallah fiqh. So he was one of those who, under a tree in the place called Hudaybiyah, close to Mecca, took an oath of allegiance with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There was rumor that filtered in that Uthman ibn Affan, who the Muslims, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had sent to parley with the kuffar of Mecca, had been killed. If this had happened, it would have been, a violation of the of what was between the Muslims and the kuffar at that time. So they were going for Umrah. Because of that, they didn't have any fighting weapon on them. They only had the normal weapons like daggers and things like that travelers at that point in time would carry with them, to maybe kill an animal and things like that. And many of them didn't have any weapon at all. So the Prophet ﷺ took an oath of allegiance from the people present, from Muslims present, that if the news happens to be true, then they will fight, even as they were. So one of the people that took this oath of allegiance under the tree in Hudaybiyah was Salama bin al-Aqwa. He said, "Kunna nusalli ma'a Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam fi Salat al-Jum'ah." We used to pray with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in Salat al-Jum'ah. Thumma nunsarif, then we will depart the prayer grounds of the mosque. وَلَيْسَ لِلْحَيْطَانِ ظِلٌّ نَسْتَظِلُّ بِهِ. And at the time that we depart, there will be no dhil, there will be no shadow, نَسْتَظِلُّ بِهِ. There will be no dhil, there will be no shadow, لِلْحَيْطَانِ, cast by the walls, nastadilu bih, that we used to shade ourselves. So this is what Salama ibn Aqwa, i.e., when they were leaving, at that time that they were leaving, there wouldn't be shadows cast by the walls that will be sufficient for them to use to shade themselves from the sun. So this was talking about, times of summer, when you will need to shade yourself. And it also shows that at that time, to shade themselves, they will move close to the walls in order to get, shadows. We're talking about, they weren't high-rise buildings, or, and we were talking about the desert where the trees were limited. So the things that will cast shadows were walls of buildings. So this hadith is hadith number 4168 in Sahih al-Bukhari, and it's also in Sahih Muslim. Wafi love, in one narration of the hadith, says, Salama ibn Aqwa says, Kunna nujammi', we used to do Jum'ah, we used to congregate for Jum'ah, ma'a Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. إِذَا زَالَتِ الشَّمْسِ, we will do this when the zawal had appeared. The zawal is when the sun has left the zenith. When in the morning, when the sun rises, above the horizon, it continues to rise until it reaches its peak, the zenith. When it reaches this, then it begins to decline again, going towards Maghrib. So when it immediately begins to decline from its highest point, this is called zawal, the coming down, the decline. So this is when Dhuhr, the Salat enters. Immediately the decline begins to happen. So this is also the time for Salatul Jumu'ah. This is also the time for Salatul Jumu'ah. So, 1 second, please. So that is إذا زالت. So when the Zawal time has come, إذا زالت الشمس. This is when they would do Jumu'ah, observe Salatul Jumu'ah with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. ثم نرجع فنتبع الفيء. Then we will depart the mosque looking for shadows. The fay is the shadow cast by any object at the time of Zawal. The fay is the shadow cast by an object at the time of Zawal. So this is now. So this is the hadith. Let's just go over it again. كنا نصلي مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم صلاة الجمعة ثم ننصرف وليس للحيطان ظل نستظل به وفي اللفظ كنا نجمع مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا زلت الشمس ثم نرجع فنتتبع الفيء. We used to observe Salatul Jumu'ah with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and thereafter we will leave, and at that point there will be no shadow cast by the walls that we can use to shade ourselves. In a narration it says, we used to observe Jumu'ah with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when the sun had left its highest point. After that we will return, that is home, we will leave, and we will start looking for shadows, i.e. Looking for how to shade themselves on their way, back. So let us go to Tanbih as usual and see one or two things about the Rawi and also the place of this hadith in the Sharia. Al-Rawi, the narrator of the hadith, is Salama bin Amru bin Sanan al-Aslami radiyallahu anhu. Al-Aqur laqab jiddihi Sinan. The name Aqur, it says Salama ibn Aqur, is actually Salama, the son of Amru, the son of Sinan, from the Al-Aslami. Now, Sinan was his grandfather, who had a nickname, Al-Aqur. So in naming him, his father's name is not mentioned. It just goes directly and says Salama ibn Aqur, just like saying Salama ibn Sanan. It happens even today in the English name of the way of naming. We call so and so maybe AbduLlaah Fasasi, for instance. Fasasi is not his father's name, is the name that has been adopted as a family name, and that is actually a recent thing. In where we come from, the naming was just like the Arabs will name. They say, who is that? It's Abdul-Razak. Abdul-Razak, which Abdul-Razak is that? Abdul-Razak, the son of Ahmed, the butcher. Okay, I know him. So they link you to your father. That's how the name is. So-so, the son of so-so. So, however, now the surname, which is probably the name of somebody, one of the grandfathers or great-grandfather or something like that, has now been adopted as the family name. So just like Al-Aqur, a nickname here has been adopted, it also happens during our time, in our own naming system too. Some of those family names are not names per se, but nicknames. So for instance, if somebody's name is Giwa, Giwa is a title for the leader of a social group. So it's not the name of a person. So it's not somebody will be given birth to and they name him Giwa, no. So if the family adopted that, it's because the family, whoever amongst their earlier fathers was held that title and was popularly known by that. So they, as a family, now took it up as a name. So the same thing here. Salama ibn Amr ibn Sannan al-Aslami. Kana shuja'an. He was a very brave person. Ada'an, and he was a sprinter also. He could run very fast. Yes, bikul khayl, could compete, with horses. And of course, that is used by way of speaking, not necessarily in terms of, as it is. However, there was an instance that brought about, this, and we'll mention that subsequently. It says, Awalu mashahadatihi ghazwatu Hudaybiyah. The first battle that he partook in was in the Battle of Hudaybiyah. Baya'a Nabiya sallallahu alayhi wa sallam fiha. He took an oath of allegiance with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in Hudaybiyah. Ala al-maut, under the penalty of death. When you do something under the penalty of death is you do that thing, like in this case of Hudaybiyah, he swore allegiance to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he will fight alongside the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, against the kuffar, even if the penalty for doing so will be death. And he was one of those who didn't have anything that he came with as weapon. So the Prophet ﷺ gave him a shield. Now, barakallahu fikum. Al-maut. Now, so he didn't have anything to fight with, and the Prophet ﷺ gave him a shield. And he saw his uncle, who also didn't have a shield, so he gave that shield to his uncle. So, but that didn't stop him from, pledging his life in defense of the Muslims at that point in time. Radiyallahu anhu. So he pledged allegiance with the Prophet ﷺ, but twice or thrice during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. واستقضى لقاح النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Now, there was another incident after Hudaybiyah, and that was the Muslims. The Prophet ﷺ was in a place called Al-Ghaba. We talked about it. We showed us the map. It was like a bushy area with vegetations. Not far from Al-Medina. And this while the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims were there, the Prophet ﷺ sent his slave, Rabah, with his camels, to go and graze. So whilst the slave was there with the camels, a tribe from Ghatfan, raided the camels, killed the slave, took the slave's wife along with the camels. The camels were pregnant camels that had, milk in their udders. So they were prized possessions. Not only that, they, were pregnant, meaning it was like 2 in 1, They also had milk, in their orders. So they raided them. When Salma bin Aqor, learned about this, he, went after these raiders, these thieves, and he was alone chasing them because they had, seized property along with the camels. Their horses were not as fast on their feet as they would have been if they were not carrying any luggage. And also, they were also herding camels that were slower, along with them. So that also limited their speed. So that gave Ibn al-Aqur the opportunity to chase them down. And because they were many and he was one chasing them, he was able to use that, it was easier for him to target many than for many to target him. So one by one, he took the raiders, out along with their animals, hamstringing their animals until they saw that the only way out was to abandon their loot and, take off. And that is what, they did. So that's just a short biography of Salama ibn al-Aqur. Let's keep this part. Mawdu al-Hadith. Let us, what is the place of this hadith in the Sharia? Bayanu mata kana Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam yusalli al-Jum'ah. This hadith explains to us when the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam used to observe Salat al-Jum'ah. This hadith explains that to us. Sharhu kalimat. وكان أصحاب الشجرة, the companions of the tree, أي الذين بايعوا النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم تحت الشجرة وهي السمرة أو سدرة في حديبية, بايع النبي الصحابة تحتها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على ألا يفروا حين أرسل عثمان رضي الله عنه ابن عفان إلى قريش بمكة ليفاوضهم فأشيع أنه قد قتل. Said this Treaty of Hudaybiyah happened behind, under a tree in Hudaybiyah, where the companions of the Prophet ﷺ swore an oath of allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ that they will not flee, they will fight. When and this happened when Uthman was sent by the Prophet ﷺ to the Quraysh to negotiate with them. Then a rumor came that he had been killed. فأنزل الله فيهم, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed verse concerning these companions who took an oath of allegiance with the Prophet ﷺ, not to flee but to fight, if the story was true. لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, that Allah is pleased with them. So this is different from the general pleasure that Allah has with the companions. رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. This is more specific, the companions that took that allegiance under the tree. So لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Allah has been pleased, or is pleased with the believers, إِذْ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ, when they took allegiance from you at under the tree. وَكَانَ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ 1,400, and there were more than 1,400 that took this oath of allegiance. وَلَمْ يَخْتَلِفْ عَنْهَا إِلَّا الْجِدْ ibn Qais, and they no one refused to take this allegiance except for one person, Al-Jad ibn Qais. وكان ذلك في ذي القعدة سنة 6 من الهجرة, and that was in the month of ذو القعدة, the 11th month in the 6th year of Hijrah. وقد أخفى الله مكان الشجرة. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his wisdom had made the place of this tree where the bay actually took place forgotten. And of course, we know what the benefits of that is. If it has been remembered, if it's a place that's still remembered till today, many people will be doing a lot of bid'ah, there. The bid'ahs that we see, for instance, people trying to pray to the grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was buried in the house of Aisha radiallahu anha, which is where he died. And because of expansion of the mosque, it has swallowed not only that place, but every house in the city of Medina at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The mosque, as we find it today, has swallowed all those places up. So people will go to the area where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has been is buried, and they will try to worship that grave and things like that. So part of the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he made that place forgotten where the people took the oath. وَكَانَ ذَلِكَ فِي now وروي عن عمر بن الخطاب أن رضي الله عنه أنه أمر بقطعها وقطعت فقطعت فليس يعلم مكانها حتى الآن ولله الحمد والمنة. It was reported that Umar ibn al-Khattab ordered that the tree should be chopped down, and it was chopped down. And till today, nobody knows where the exact place, is anymore. Alhamdulillah. And because of things like this, what the bid'ah people do, that Umar radiallahu anhu will have commanded that. Now, so we've taken the the Sharh al-Ijmali. Let us go to Tayseer and pick one or two things of ikhtilaf. We see that in this hadith, the hadith told us about, when we went to Tanbih, it told us the hadith tells us about the time when the Prophet ﷺ would, would observe the Salah. Let's go back there. Rawi Mawdu' Hadith. Okay, now Bayan Mata Kana Yusalli al-Jumu'ah. So it tells us when the Prophet ﷺ will observe the Jumu'ah. But in addition, it also tells us when the Prophet ﷺ will start the Jumu'ah. So we have mention of when he will start. We have a mention of when he will end. Because in this part, it tells us that they will finish the Jumu'ah. It says, ثُمَّ نَنْصَرِفُ وَلَيْسَ لِلْحَيْطَانِ ظِلْ نَسْتَظِلُّ بِهِ. That will finish the Salah, and there will be no dhil, there will be no shadow that will be worthy of being used to shade ourselves. Note, not that there won't be shadow, not that it isn't time for zawal, but the zawal at that point in time, the length of the shadow at that point in time will not be sufficient to shade ourselves. If it has stopped by saying that walaysa lil haytan or lil hitan dhil, there will be no shadow cast by the wall, then it will mean that there was no shadow cast by the wall, meaning the sun was directly above the walls, meaning the sun was at the zenith. It wasn't yet time for zawal. There was no shadow. But once it leaves the zawal, there will be shadow. Once it leaves the zawal, there will be shadow. So he adds nastadillu bihi. So it has qualified the general meaning of there is no shadow, and now added there's no shadow worthy of using as a shade or sufficient to use as a shade. So it doesn't mean there is no shadow, but it means that there's not enough shadow or the shadow there is not enough that we'll use it as a shade. It hasn't yet extended significantly away from the wall. So this understanding is important in the ikhtilaf that follows. Because from this hadith, and similar ones, some of the scholars hold the opinion that Jumu'ah can start before the sun reaches a zenith, that it can start at the same time as the Salatul Eid. That it can start same time as Salatul Eid. When the sun has risen above the horizon, about the length of a spear, then we can start Salatul Eid, Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha. So based on this, however, there is the other part where it says we will do Jumu'ah with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, observe Jumu'ah with the message of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِذَا زَالَتِ الشَّمْسِ, when the sun has left the meridian. ثُمَّ نَرْجِعُ, then we'll go back, فَنَتَتَّبَعُ الْفَيْءِ, looking for shadows. So this part, as inserted what was missing in this other part. This part says, only talks about we will leave and there'll be no shadow sufficient to use as a shade at the time when they finish the Jummah, which could cause one to conclude, as some of the scholars have concluded, that they started before Zawal, before the sun reached its zenith. There was khutbah, and there was the Salat itself. So if after the Salah, the dhil, the shadow, was not sufficient to use as shade, then it means that they must have started before the Zawal. That is one understanding that could be gotten from there. Although it could also mean that the khutbah and the Salah was very short. The khutbah and the Salah was very short. Now, which one of the two? You said that whenever there is a ihtimal, then we can't use one to kick out the other except for added evidence. The added evidence is now here, where it says, إِذَا زَالَتِ الشَّمْسِ, we will congregate for Jummah with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِذَا زَالَتِ الشَّمْسِ, when the sun had left the meridian, once it had begun to decline. After that, we begin to look for shadows. Then we bring both hadiths together. We're looking for shadows, but the shadows that we find will not be sufficient to shade ourselves. Now, so let's go to the ikhtilaf of the scholars on this issue. Ikhtilaf al-ulama, the different opinion among the scholars. اتفق العلماء على أن آخر وقت صلاة الجمعة هو آخر وقت صلاة الظهر. The scholars are united that the end of Salatul Jumu'ah is the end of Salatul Dhuhr, and that is when the shadow of an object equals the length of that object. And of course, that is plus or minus the residual shadow. If you are living at in any region away from the equator, when the sun is at its zenith, if you're away from the equator, there will be a residual shadow. There will be no points when you will not have a shadow to either your side or your back or your front. There will be a shadow, a residual shadow somewhere because of the angulation of the sun to you. But if you are on the equator, when the sun is at its highest points, it is directly atop your head. So your shadow will be under you, not in front, behind, or to your side. So if you're living away from the equator, when the sun reaches a zenith, you have to measure the residual shadow and add it to the other side. Once the sun flips to the other side, you will now the time for dhuhr will be once the sun has covered that residual shadow and now increases upon it by the tiniest amounts of length. Then that is the time for what do you call it, for dhuhr. But in the equator, once the sun, the shadow rather, comes away from underneath you, that is the time for dhuhr. So the scholars are agreed upon the fact that the time for dhuhr, the time when dhuhr ends, is the time when Jumu'ah ends. وَاخْتَلَفُوا فِي ابْتِدَاءِ وَقْتِهَا. However, with respect to when Jumu'ah starts, they differ. فَذَهَبَ الْأَئِمَّةُ ثَلَاثَةٌ. Three of the popular four A'imma are of the position that إِلَى أَنَ وَقْتَهَا تَبْدَأُ بِزَوَالِ الشَّمْسِ كَالظُّهْرِ. They say that the time for Jumu'ah, the time to start Jumu'ah starts at the same time the Dhuhr starts, which is immediately the sun leaves the zenith. مُسْتَدِلِينَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ بِأَدِيلَةٍ. And they use evidences to buttress this position of theirs. Minha, one of these evidences that they use is Marwa al-Bukhari, what Imam Bukhari narrated in Hadith number 904 from Anas bin Malik radiyallahu anhu, who said, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يصلي الجمعة حين تميل الشمس. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam will observe the Jum'ah when the sun leaves the zenith. That is when he will observe it. وذهب الإمام أحمد في المشهور عنه. Imam Ahmad, in the most popular position from him, is of the opinion that إلى دخول وقتها بقدر دخول صلاة العيد. That the time when Jumu'ah starts, the earliest time to observe Jumu'ah is the earliest time to observe Salatul Eid. وَاسْتَدَالَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ بِأَدِيلَةٍ. And he also brings forth evidences. What are those evidences? One of them is منها رواية أولى في حديث الباب, is the first part of today's hadith, where it says, we will leave the ثم ننصرف, we will leave after the Jummah prayers, نتتبع وليس للحيطان ظل نستدل به. We will leave the salah and there will be no shadow sufficient to, shade ourselves with. So they're saying that understanding we mentioned earlier, that it must therefore mean that the salah started before zawal. They told us that there are two possibilities there. You can't use one to knock off the other. So meaning that this hadith, that first part of the hadith, is ambiguous. The second part clearly gives evidence to starting after zawal. So the evidence for starting before zawal, before the sun has departed from its highest point, is what is left to establish. If we find it, then we'll now have, the evidence for starting before zawal is there. Evidence for starting after zawal is there. So you can start in any which one. However, up until what we've gotten to right now, what we have is evidence for starting after zawal, as Anas bin Malik said, that the Prophet ﷺ will start the Salat al-Jumu'ah half hina zalat al-shams, when the sun has left the meridian. So let us see if we find evidence for starting before the zawal. But the understanding that because the walls do not have sufficient shadow to shade ourselves with is not evidence. Rather, what it does is bring two things, possibilities to us. So we need a specific evidence like that of Anas bin Malik in support, which supports the position that Jummah starts after the zawal, just like Dhuhr. So let's look for evidence for the other position if we find. Well, okay. So one of the evidences of the position that Jummah starts, the earliest time for observing Jummah is before Zawal, is the hadith. The first part of the hadith of today, which we said brings two possibilities, not something definitive. وَمِنْ أَدِلَتِهِ مَا أَخْرَجَهُ الْمُسْلِمُ أَحْمَدُ. Another evidence I bring is what Imam Muslim and Imam Ahmad brought in the hadith. من حديث جابر بن عبد الله, from the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah, أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يصلي الجمعة ثم نذهب إلى جمالنا فنريحها حين تزول الشمس. This is a specific evidence in support of observing the Salah to Jumu'ah, starting to observe the Salah to Jumu'ah before Zawal. So why is it specific? It says, Jabir ibn Abdullah says, Ana Nabiya sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Kana yusalli al-Jumu'ah. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam used to observe the Salatul Jumu'ah. And he used the word Kana. It's not something that happened once. So he used to observe the Jumu'ah, Salah. Thumma, thereafter, after we've observed the Jumu'ah, nadhhab ila jamalina. Then we'll go to our camels. Fanuruhuha, and we'll rest them. Hina tazulu shams, when the sun had, left the meridian, when it had begun to, decline. So they are going to their camels, watering them and all that happened at the time tazul, when this is mudari, present continuous, when the sun begins to decline, or when the sun is declining, that is when they will go, there. So this means that, and this happens after the Salah. So it leaves only one interpretation, therefore, that the Salah took place before they went to the camel. And the time they went to the camel was when the sun was, declining. So the Salah must then have taken place before the sun began to decline. So Sheikh Al-Basaam says, Walil Jumhur, the position of the majority, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Abu Hanifa, and many of the other scholars in the majority, they respond, بِتَعْوِيلَاتِ لِهَذِهِ الْأَحَادِيثِ بَعِيدَةِ. They bring very tenuous explanations to this hadith and similar ones that give no other clear meaning other than that the Salat was observed before Zawal. So, wal-haq, the truth, Sheikh Al-Basaam says, مَا قَالَهُ al-Shawkani, is what Imam al-Shawkani said in his book, Nil al-Awtar. It says, وَلَا مَلْجَعَ, said there's no escape, إِلَى تَعْوِيلَاتِ al-musta'asif, إِلَى تَعْوِيلَاتِ al-musta'asifa, for us to go to excuses to that are pitiful, that try to re-explain this clear ahadith that permit observance of Jumu'ah before the Zawal, التي ارتكبها الجمهور, which is the position of the majority. واستدلالهم بأحاديث القاطعة بأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى الجمعة بعد الزوال لا ينفي الجواز قبله. That we have a hadith that established, like the hadith of Anas bin Malik, that says the Prophet ﷺ used to observe the Jumu'ah prayers when the sun has left the meridian, does not also go nullify that he used to also observe the Jumu'ah, at other times before the zenith, before the sun left the zenith. So Anas bin Malik didn't say there was no time that he there was no time that he observed the Salah, there was no time that he observed the Salah before the sun left the zenith. He didn't say so. He said he used to observe. And Jabir bin Abdullah said he used to observe the salah. After they have observed the salah, they'll go to water their camels when the sun is declining. So the only way out of that, therefore, is to accept both a hadith, those that say that the salah took place before the zawal, and those that say that the hadith took place. Those that say that the salah took place before the zawal, and those that say that the salah took place or started after the zawal. Then the Sheikh rahimahullah, Sheikh Al-Basaam, says, Qultu, I say that al-awla, what is better, wal-afdal, and more meritorious, as-salah ba'da zawal, is to observe the salah after the zawal. Why? لأنه الغالب من فعل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, because it is the most preponderant out of the actions of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. ولأنه الوقت المجمع عليه بين العلماء, and because it is a position that the vast majority of the scholars, favor. إلا أن يكون تم حاجة من حر شديد وليس عندهم ما يستذلون به, except if we have a situation of extreme heat, and there's nothing with which the people will shade themselves with. أو يريدون الخروج للجهاد قبل زوال, or they want to go for jihad before zawal. So فلا بأس من صلاتها قبل زوال. In that case, or in these cases, there'll be no there'll be no problem with observing the salah before the zawal. Allahu a'lam. From what we've learned from the scholars, it might be that since none of the reporters of the hadith that indicates clearly that the Prophet ﷺ observed Jumu'ah Salah before the Zawal, none of them tied it to a social event happening, like jihad or extreme weather. In the case of Anas bin Malik, it mentioned extreme weather. There will be no there will be no the walls will cast no shadow sufficient to shade ourselves. So there was that is definitely during the summer. That of Jabir bin Abdullah also mentions the same thing, or rather, one of Jabir bin Abdullah just said that they will go to their camels and water them when the sun is declining. This could happen during summer. It could happen during winter. Now, the hadith of Anas bin Malik is being used by the minority to establish that you can observe it before zawal. But it doesn't say that the reason why they observed it before zawal was because of the weather. The hadith of Jabir bin Abdullah is used to establish clearly that the salah took place before zawal. However, it doesn't say link any jihad or any weather condition to it. It just says when the salah is finished, we'll go to water our camels and to rest our camels, and that will be at the time of zawal. So they didn't link any social or communal or weather pattern to it. So from what we learned from the scholars, it might be the best to leave it open that way, that when the imam, or in our case over here, the Al-Qaf decides that they want to do it this way, then because we know there's evidence for it, then it's permissible. Otherwise, if we tie it to specific events that the narrator of the hadith did not tie it to, then we will be in need of evidence for restricting it to those instances. So what they all, tied it to was the Prophet ﷺ, who was the head of the Muslims, the ruler of the Muslims, the one in authority. So when we're tied to that too. So when those in authority say we'll observe it before Zawal, at the normal time that we'll observe Eid, we'll follow them. When they say we'll observe it after, Zawal, normal time that Dhuhr will start, we'll follow them. Because in both instances, we have a hadith to support that. Finally, ma yukhad min al-hadith. What are the things we take from the hadith? Mashru'iyatu takbir fil jum'ah mutlaqan. Tabkir, sorry. That we see that it is legislated, it is part of the Sharia to go early for the Jumu'ah, mutlaqan, i.e. not with respect to going early for the Salah or going early for the khutbah, but going early for the entire Jumu'ah. That means you are there before the khutbah starts, not to talk of before the Salah, starts. So you go there early, because if you combine this hadith to the previous ahadith, wherever the hadith we took last week, the one who gets to the Jumu'ah in the first hour is as if he qarraba badana, he slaughtered or offered in sacrifice a camel. So this is not linked to when the Salah starts, not when the khutbah starts, because the hadith says when the Imam arrives, hadarat al-malaika yastami'una al-khutbah. The angels, will, attend and listen to the khutbah. Yastami'una dhikr. They will listen to the khutbah. So that is, so we see in this hadith, in relation to previous ones, that it is part of the Sharia to attend the Jumu'ah early. سواء كانوا في شتاء أم صيف ويكون حديث الإبراد خاصة بالظهر. Now, so they say this hadith, the one that we took last week especially, is applicable getting early to the Salah for the Jumu'ah, sorry, not only the Salah. Getting ready for the Jumu'ah, going early for the Jumu'ah is something that is to be practiced whether in winter or in summer. Whether in winter or in summer. And it is not to be linked to the Prophet ﷺ's practice of abroad, observing the Dhuhr prayers when the heat of the sun has abated in summer. So sometimes the Prophet ﷺ, not always, sometimes when the heat is intense in summer, he would wait towards Asr, but still within the range of Dhuhr. And when the heat has abated a little, then he will observe Dhuhr. This is called ibrad, cooling of Salatul Dhuhr. This is specific to Dhuhr. So we'll now say because Jumu'ah replaces Dhuhr, that will apply, the same, that this hadith applies to it. No. If we apply it, we haven't gotten out of the range of Jumu'ah. It's just a mention of a fine point that we can't use the hadith that establishes ibrad for Dhuhr to establish ibrad, delaying till a cooler part of the range for Jumu'ah. But can we delay Salatul Jumu'ah within its range to maybe like this time, now, when we observed it about let's say like 2 hours ago, but it is still the time range for Dhuhr still. So can we, in the heat of summer or for any other reason that the Imam sees within the range of Jumu'ah, delay it to like this period in time? Yes, we can, because it is a range. Any time one observes any salah within its range, that salah is accepted, all other things being equal. Number two, ظاهر الحديث جواز صلاة الجمعة قبل الزوال. We see that what is apparently gotten from this hadith is that it is permissible to observe Salatul Jumu'ah before Zawal. حيث كانوا يصلون ثم ينصرفون وليس هناك الظل يستدلون به وهو الصحيح كما تقدم. Because by the time they leave, there will be no shadow cast by walls that will be sufficient to shade themselves. We said that alone carries two meanings that we talked about. However, with supporting hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah, we see that one of those two meanings is supported. The hadith of Anas bin Malik supports the second one. Let us go to Tanbih and see what the Sheikh brings as benefits extractable from the hadith. Fawaid hadith. We see that مشروعية المبادرة بصلاة الجمعة من حين الزوال حتى في شدة الحر. Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen is of the position of the majority, as we see here. It says مشروعية المبادرة بصلاة الجمعة من حين الزوال حتى في شدة الحر. We see, or right, it doesn't say it's of the second position. It could mean it doesn't matter, because here he's saying that we see that it's part of the Sharia to observe the Jumu'ah prayers immediately after the sun leaves the zenith, even up until in the severe, severe summer, because the Prophet ﷺ didn't do ibrad. He didn't delay it to the later part. They observed it in a condition that when they were leaving, the people were in need of shade, and the walls could not offer them shade by way of shadow at that time of the day. So they were in need of shade. Why? Because it was extreme summer at that point of time, the peak of summer around that time. Number two, اتقاء الناس ما يؤمله أو يؤذيه من حر أو برد ولا يعود ذلك من ترف المذموم. Now, it says in this we see that someone can take precautions to guard against ma yu'limuhu, what will harm him or what will cause him pain, aw yu'dhihi, or will harm him, what will cause him pain or what will harm him, min har, whether that is heat or bard or cold or any other thing, for that matter, that it is permissible to do so. The Prophet ﷺ saw his companions looking for shade to shade themselves in summer. I didn't say, why are you, doing this or something like that. Wala yu'ad dhalik, and that is not, counted min at-taraf al-madhlum, as something that is extreme or and despicable or something like that. So it is not part of taqwa that you go in the heat of sun and you don't take any precaution to guard yourself from the heat of the sun or the rays of the sun or something like that. So let us see what Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen sees to the difference of opinion amongst the scholars on this issue of the starting point of Jumu'ah. استدل بعض العلماء بهذا الحديث على جواز صلاة الجمعة قبل الزوال بناء على أن المراد بقول السلمة وليس للحيطان ظل نستدل به نفي الظل مطلقا. Said some of the scholars use this hadith, the first part of the hadith, where Salama ibn Aqwa says that they will depart and the walls will not have any shadow worthy of being used, sufficient of being used to shade themselves, as evidence that there was no shadow at all. We told ourselves that that understanding alone, without the supporting evidence from the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah, doesn't cut it, isn't sufficient. It rather brings two. It brings a possibility that there was no shadow at all. It brings some possibility that there was shadow but wasn't sufficient. So the Sheikh Rahimahullah says, لكن دليل على جواز صلاة الجمعة قبل زوال ما رواه البخاري في صحيحه عن سهل ibn Sa'd رضي الله عنه. Says, however, the evidence كنا نصلي مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم الجمعة ثم تكون القائلة والقائلة نصف النهار كما في القاموس. Now, so the Sheikh Rahimahullah says, this what is missing here, what is understood, is that this evidence, using that first part of the hadith of Salam ibn Aqwa as evidence, does not cut it, because of what we explained earlier. It carries two meanings, not one. So you can't use it, as evidence for observing Salah before Zawal. The Shaykh Rahimahullah says, the evidence that cuts it, he didn't bring the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah. Now, another evidence from Sahal ibn Sa'd is that Sahal ibn Sa'd said that كنا نصلي مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. We will pray with the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. الجمعة, صلاة الجمعة. ثم تكون القائلة. Then we will go for قائلة. And what is قائلة? والقائلة نصف ثم تكون القائلة. Then the time of قائلة will arrive. Then what is قائلة? نصف النهار, half of the day. And half of the day is when what? The sun reaches its zenith. Half of the day, 12 noon, is when midday is when the sun reaches its zenith. Kama fi al-qamus, as it is in the dictionary. So that is the Arabic dictionary. So that is that's why they say qaylula, for instance. Qaylula is your nap, that you have midday nap. So he said that they will observe the Jumu'ah, then it will be time of Qa'ila. And then the time for Qa'ila, the midday will arrive. So that supports the hadith of Jabir and Abdullah, that then they will go to their camels and rest them, and that will now be the time when the sun will have left, will be leaving the meridian. So like Imam al-Shawkani says, the majority have no strong thing to move on. We are not the one that set the time of the Salat. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that sending the Prophet ﷺ to explain it to us. So if he explained it to us in a certain way, then we have to accept all the ways in which he, explained it to us. So the way he explained it to us was that we can observe it before Zawal, we can observe it after Zawal. However, most of the reports show that the Prophet ﷺ observed it after Zawal. So we can also include that into the mix. In practicing both, we also practice the one that was more, reported from the Prophet ﷺ, like Sheikh Al-Basaam, said, where he said, قلت الأفضل والصلاة, he said, قلت الأولى والأفضل الصلاة بعد الزوال. He said, what is better is salah after zawal, لأنه غالب من فعل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, because that was what was reported mostly from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. I modify that by saying that since both of them were reported, we do both of them. But since one was reported more than the other, then the Imam will also be doing the Sunnah if he does one more than the other, i.e. observe it after Zawal more than he observes it before Zawal. And Allahu A'lam. Do we have any questions?
No question, Jazakumullah khairan, not from my side.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum assalam to Allah.
Yeah, I have a question, but it's not pertaining to the Juma. But the question I want to ask is, can we do sujood sahu when we are praying behind Imam? If personally we make mistakes, for example, if when the Imam is standing up for, let's say, for the last rakah, for example, and then we mistakenly sit down, and then we've already said our Allahu Akbar, but we remember that, oh, Imam is standing, we stand up. So are we allowed to do sujood sahu, or Imam covers everything? Jazakumullah khair.
Wa alaikum barakallahu fi. The evidence that we have for if one was alone, for instance, and that happened to one, one was praying alone, and one sat, then remembered, then of course one would do sujood sahu. If one had sat down before that, sat down longer than one would have sat for sujood al-istiraha, that is the brief sitting before going for the next standing. So if one had sat for a period longer than sujood istiraha, then one will be required to do sujood sahu of ba'di now, because one has added to the salah. But if it's equivalent to or less than sujood istiraha, then there's nothing upon one. Now, because what one has added is something that is not part of the salah, that is a sitting that is not part of the salah. Now, but in this case, one is praying behind the Imam. If one prays behind the Imam and it makes a violation that is either sunnah or wajib, but not a rukn, then it is waived for him. For instance, somebody does not say Allahu Akbar or Sami Allahu liman hamida or Rabbana wa lakal hamd when he's moving from one position to the other. There are different opinions among the scholars about the position of those, the ruling on those things. However, the most correct opinion, Allahu A'lam, is that they are wajibat. Things are compulsory to do. You cannot intentionally say, I'm not going to say them, in the salah. But if you forget to say them, then if you are praying alone, then you do sujood sahu. If you miss them, you do sujood sahu because you deleted them from where they were supposed to be. Then this will be a qabli that you will do. You've omitted from your salah. But if you are praying behind the Imam covers anything that is sunnah that you forgot. Sunnah, anyway, you can intentionally miss it out. For instance, the surah that comes after Surah Al-Fatiha is sunnah. It is not wajib. It is not a rukn. If you are praying alone and you intended to insert it and you forgot, you are not obliged to do sujood sahu. Although the scholars say if you do, then there is still under the armpits of saying whoever forgets, then he should do sujood sahu. That general statement does not specify whether what you forgot was sunnah or something compulsory or something that was rukn. So you are still covered by that. If you do sujood sahu when you forgot to omit something that was sunnah, mustahab, that you intended to insert but forgot. If you are behind the Imam the Imam covers that. And I don't know of a case where the Imam, where if you make a mistake in Sunnah or Wajib, where you would be required to, to bring it back. I do not know of any text to that effect, or any saying of the scholars to that effect. However, if what you missed is something that is compulsory, for instance, somebody in the last rakah cannot remember if he recited Surah Al-Fatiha or not in the third rakah of Dhuhr. So he knows he recited in the first, in the second, and also in this last one, but the third rakah is not sure, or the second rakah is not sure if he recited Surah Al-Fatiha or not. Surah Al-Fatiha is not Sunnah. Surah Al-Fatiha is not Wajib. It is Ruknu. It is above Wajib. So therefore, he has to do what? He has to, after the Salah, he will stand up. He will, what he has evidence for is that he observed three valid, three valid rakahs. There's a rakah that he's not sure whether he observed the ruknu, one ruknu in it, and that is Surah Al-Fatiha in this case. So he will stand up to bring that fourth rakah, because the basis is that he didn't observe that rakah. Once you don't observe, La salata illa bi Fatihatil Kitab, that's the hadith. There's no salah except with Surah Al-Fatiha. So in this case, he's not sure if he brought it. So we go back to the basis. The default is that he didn't observe Surah Al-Fatiha in it, and hence that rakah is not void. So he will stand up when the Imam says salam to bring his own fourth rakah, the own fourth valid rakah. Say Surah Al-Fatiha in it, and I will do sujood sahu afterwards, because there's now addition to his salah. The things he has done is above 4 rakahs. There are some movements that he did in excess, so that is above what is required. So he will do the sujood sahu after the salah. So again, for sunnah and for that is sunnah mustahab, and for things that are wajib, if you're praying behind the imam covers them, and you are not required to do sujood sahu for them. Now, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.